The morning of June 8th, 793. The fog over the North Sea has not yet lifted. Now ask yourself, if you had been there that morning, on what the world considered the safest place on Earth, a holy island that God himself was believed to protect, would you have known you were living the last hours of your life? And here's the bigger question. Were the men who attacked that island truly savage barbarians, or were they one of the most sophisticated strike teams history has ever produced? Men who had calculated the island's naval engineering, military intelligence, and geopolitical vulnerability with surgical perfection. By the end of this video, you will see clearly what brought Lindisfarne to its knees was not barbarian savagery. It was the convergence of a tidal calendar, a political collapse, and the most advanced engineering tradition of the age, all intersecting on a single morning. And the logic of that convergence still operates exactly the same way today. First, you'll step inside the island. Then, you'll look at the ships. After that, you'll see how a political system can leave its own coastlines completely exposed. And finally, you'll understand why none of this was an accident. Now, step through the door. Morning prayers have just ended in the scriptorium. Monk Eadfrith sits at his desk, a sheet of vellum before him. Parchment scraped from 150 calves. The sharp smell of lime and fresh hide saturates the room. Ink distilled from candle soot, pure carbon, smooth and deep black, trembles at the tip of a goose feather quill. The sound of a pen scraping across parchment pulses through the walls in its familiar rhythm. One monk hums softly, another smiles in silence. And somewhere, the thin, wandering note of a bone flute drifts through the air. This is not merely a monastery. Every manuscript produced here is the fruit of a decade of devotion. Blues dyed with indigo, greens derived from copper oxide, sacred figures gilded with beaten gold leaf. These pages were a civilizational output that had no equal anywhere else on Earth at the time. But here is the truth that no one tells you. Monasteries in this era functioned as a kind of central bank. Northumbrian nobles deposited their gold and silver reserves here, under God's protection. Royal treasuries were stored on these islands. Diplomatic gifts, tax revenues, jewel-encrusted reliquaries, all of it piled and waiting. Inside this island that appeared impregnable, but was in fact entirely defenseless. Put it in a modern economist's terms, Lindisfarne was a central branch where an entire nation had deposited all its reserves in a single physical location, trusting its security to nothing but faith. And that branch had never once been robbed. This morning, that changes. Now, step outside. Look out to sea. Something is out there. First a point, then two, then a silhouette. Sails. And the hulls beneath those sails look like nothing that has ever sailed the North Sea before. Viking longships don't move through the water. They skim across the surface of it. How? The answer is buried in the bones of these vessels. 200-year-old oak trees are split radially along their grain. Not sawn, split. That distinction preserves the structural integrity of the wood. These planks are then overlapped and fastened with iron rivets. It's called the Clinker technique, and it gives the hull an extraordinary quality: flexibility. The ship doesn't resist the force of heavy waves. It bends with them, like a sea serpent. They draw barely 3 feet of water. They can beach on shallow shores, rocky outcroppings, tidal flats, anywhere they choose. And their theoretical maximum speed, calculated from waterline length, 10 to 12 knots. In that age, that figure was almost supernatural. These ships arrive like stealth aircraft. No one can see them coming, because by the time they are visible, they are already there. Wait, stop for a second. How does treasure this valuable end up in a place this unguarded? Why is an island this wealthy, this defenseless? The answer to that is the story of how a kingdom rots from within until its coastlines are wide open. That story begins long before the raid. Between 737 and 806 AD, 10 kings sat on the throne of Northumbria. 3 were assassinated. 5 were driven into exile. Only 2 chose of their own free will to take monastic vows. This was not a kingdom. It was a chronic crisis of power. And now, hear the most bitter scene in that crisis. Just 6 weeks before the raid, a man named Sitka, who had murdered King Alfwold years earlier, died by suicide in a fit of remorse. And his body was buried on Lindisfarne in that sacred ground. Alcuin of York, the celebrated Northumbrian scholar at Charlemagne's court, trembled when he heard it. A king killer sleeping in the heart of the holy fold. That alone was enough to lift divine protection. But it was too late, because the coastal watchtowers had been abandoned. The defense garrisons were scattered. Political rivalry had blinded the kingdom to a common threat. Northumbria, consumed by its own internal anarchy, had left its coastlines completely exposed while trying to strangle the chaos within. The Vikings knew this. Now let's get to the most critical detail, the one that proves this was no accident. Lindisfarne is a tidal island. Twice a day, the sea rises and the island is completely severed from the mainland. The royal fortress at Bamberg overlooks it but cannot reach it. Cavalry bogs down in the mudflats of the causeway. Land support becomes physically impossible. The Vikings calculated that window. They landed when the water was rising. 4 to 6 hours of isolation. Enough to plunder, enough to escape. And as the waters began to pull back, the walls of Bamberg Castle darkened on the horizon. Something was understood inside those walls. They were too late. Over the muddy crossing, the briny smell of the ocean hung in the cold air, while mounted soldiers sank deeper into the marshland. With every step, the cold metal of their helmets caught the sun, but every stride told the same story. They were only going deeper. The Longships, meanwhile, were already beyond the horizon, as if they had never come at all. The local forces stand frozen on the shore. The ships vanish. This was not a barbarian assault. This was a meticulously planned operation, one in which a scouting party had studied tidal cycles, learned the coastal geography, identified the political vacuum, and struck at precisely the right moment. And now, go back to that morning. The bone flute stopped. The silence ended. Axes fell. Ink spilled. The sound of axes hammering into heavy oak doors shattered the calm of the scriptorium. Monks dropped their quills. A dark stain spread across the vellum, swallowing the last sentence that would never be finished. The Vikings are inside! They tear down the gold crosses. They pour silver chalices into their bags. They overturn the jewel-encrusted reliquaries, and they drag the educated monks away as slaves. Men who could read, write, speak Latin. That last detail matters. The most valuable commodity in the medieval slave market was educated people. Lindisfarne wasn't merely being looted. Its capital, everything portable, liquid, tangible, was being loaded onto the North Sea. And when Europe woke up and received this news, it sat for days trying to process what it meant. The deepest cry of that generation came from Alcuin of York, at Charlemagne's court, hundreds of miles from England. The letters he wrote when he received the news have survived to the present day. Why did God not protect his own house? He demanded, and he searched for his answer in the Old Testament. To him, the Vikings were not enemies. They were divine scourges sent by God to purge the accumulated sins of Northumbria. The fiery dragons and dreadful whirlwinds recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, no one had read those signs. Priests were drinking wine, wearing fine clothes, drowning in moral laziness. And now, the day of reckoning had arrived. Alcuin's interpretation was shrewd. It contained the horror within a framework of meaning. It transformed a society's trauma into a call for reform, but it was also dangerous. Saying this is God's punishment was far easier than saying this can be stopped with military countermeasures. And that interpretation delayed the development of real defense strategies by decades. Christian Europe lost more than gold and silver in this raid. It lost its ontological security, the fear that if a place protected by God can be destroyed this easily, then nowhere is safe. Once it enters the mind, it never leaves. Look at the Doomsday Stone. It still stands on Lindisfarne. Armed figures are carved across its face. That stone is the monument of a society that buried its terror in rock. Now, stop, take a step back, and look at the whole picture. Political decay, an undefended coastline, wealth concentrated at a single point, an inadequate intelligence network, and against all of that, perfect geographic reconnaissance, revolutionary ship technology, and operational planning that weaponized tidal dynamics. What do we call that combination today? Technological asymmetry. A force with fewer resources, moving faster, strikes a system whose defense rests on the illusion of security. A system that has stacked everything into a single point of failure. That is exactly what happened at Lindisfarne. And that logic, what cybersecurity analysts today call a single point of failure, is still very much alive. The parallel between the Viking raid strategy and modern attacks on critical infrastructure is striking. First, reconnaissance. Then, identify the vulnerability. Then, strike faster than the defense can react. Then, withdraw without a trace. Lindisfarne was not a raid. It was the collapse of a system that couldn't see its own weaknesses. But here's the fascinating part. The technology that made the Vikings so devastating, those longships, those flexible hulls, that shallow water maneuverability, was the product of an engineering tradition that European civilization couldn't even imagine. And that tradition was never just a weapon. Those ships were the most ambitious exploration infrastructure humanity had ever built. They would cross the North Atlantic. They would discover Iceland, Greenland. According to some historians, they would touch the shores of North America a full 500 years before Columbus. They would push inland along the rivers of Europe, press against the walls of Constantinople, and as the Normans, conquer England itself, rewriting history along the way. But the secret of those ships still lives here, buried inside that cold morning when they first drove onto the shores of Lindisfarne. Do you know how a tree splits without breaking? How a hull speaks the language of the sea? Why a longship feels as if it were woven from wind, not wood? Answer to those questions is waiting for you. Welcome to a Viking shipyard.